Mist lifts slowly from the Kwanzaa River as the sun rises over a land already awake with order. Drums echo across the valley, not as a call to chaos, but as rhythm. Measured, deliberate, understood. Courtiers move through a royal compound built for authority, not spectacle. Spears are stacked with care. Messengers kneel, speak, and are dismissed. This is Ndongo, a sovereign African kingdom, long before European rule redraws maps and renames power. And somewhere within these walls, a girl is watching, learning the language of command before history ever records her name. Beyond the river, wooden hulls cut through the Atlantic surf. Portuguese caravels edge toward the coast, sails taut with ambition. They arrive bearing crosses, contracts, and cannons, convinced they have reached the edge of an empty world. But what they see from their decks is not wilderness. It is infrastructure, authority, resistance waiting to be tested. If this moment feels like a beginning, it is only because the collision has not yet happened. Stay with this story. By the end, you will understand how one African state, led by one extraordinary woman, forced a global empire to slow, adapt, and bleed for every mile it tried to take. Ndongo in the late 16th century is not a loose collection of villages. It is a centralized polity with titled officials, taxation systems, military ranks, and diplomatic customs refined over generations. Power flows through the Ngola, the ruler, whose authority rests not only on force, but on ritual legitimacy and control of trade routes. Iron weapons are locally produced. Agricultural surplus supports standing forces. Alliances bind neighboring sobas, regional leaders whose loyalty can determine the fate of campaigns. This is a political environment shaped by strategy, not chance. Portuguese presence on the Angolan coast begins earlier, in the late 15th century, but its ambitions sharpen with time. What starts as coastal trade soon hardens into territorial hunger. Luanda is founded in 1575 as a colonial foothold, designed not merely for commerce, but for control. From there, governors push inland, driven by two forces that will define the region's fate: the Atlantic slave trade and imperial rivalry. Ndongo's land becomes valuable not for what it lacks, but for what it already has: people, systems, and access to interior networks feeding human cargo toward the coast. Early encounters are cautious, transactional. Portuguese envoys request permission to trade, to build forts, to spread Christianity. Ndongo rulers respond with measured diplomacy, recognizing both opportunity and threat. Tribute demands follow, military pressure soon after. Fortresses creep closer to Ndongo's core territories, each one a statement that negotiation is giving way to coercion. Raids escalate. Captives are taken. Entire communities are destabilized to feed a growing transatlantic system that converts political disruption into profit. Yet expansion is anything but smooth. Portuguese forces are stretched thin, reliant on African allies whose loyalties shift with circumstance. The interior is unforgiving. Rivers flood, supply lines break, and local resistance exploits every weakness. Ndongo's armies do not meet European troops as an inferior mass. They adapt. Ambush replaces open battle. Terrain becomes a weapon. Knowledge of movement, seasons, and alliances matters more than steel alone. Within this world, Nzinga Mbande is born around 1583 into the ruling family of Ndongo. She grows up not sheltered from power, but immersed in it. Court politics are not abstract lessons. They are daily realities, marked by intrigue, betrayal, and survival. She learns to listen before speaking, to observe before acting. When Europeans later describe her intelligence, they do so with surprise, revealing more about their assumptions than her abilities. Nzinga's mind is shaped by a kingdom already fighting for its autonomy. As Portuguese pressure intensifies, Ndongo's leadership fractures under strain. Some Sobas align with the invaders, trading loyalty for advantage. Others resist, facing brutal reprisals. The political landscape becomes volatile, a shifting mosaic of resistance and collaboration. This instability is not accidental. It is cultivated. Divide and rule becomes a silent partner to the sword. What the Portuguese misunderstand is the depth of what they are confronting. Ndongo is not merely defending territory, it is defending legitimacy. Every fort built without consent, every tribute demanded under threat, erodes the balance that has governed the region for generations. War here is not a clash of civilizations. It is a calculated struggle over who has the right to rule. By the early 17th century, this struggle reaches a breaking point. The kingdom is under sustained assault. Leadership decisions will determine whether Ndongo fractures beyond repair or adapts into something new. Nzinga steps closer to the center of power, not as an anomaly, but as a product of a political system that values competence over convention when survival is at stake. The ground beneath Ndongo is already shifting before she ever takes the throne. Portuguese ambitions harden. The slave trade accelerates. Alliances calcify into enemies. And the question hanging over Central Africa is no longer whether European expansion will be resisted, but how long that resistance can be sustained, and at what cost. This is not the story of an empire arriving to rule an empty land. It is the story of an organized state forced into reinvention under relentless pressure. And the woman who will come to embody that reinvention is still waiting in the wings, watching a world close in, preparing to meet it head-on. The meeting takes place on a riverbank, where power is measured not by who speaks loudest, but by who controls the moment. Portuguese officials arrive dressed in silk and metal, confident that spectacle alone will tilt the balance. They expect submission. Instead, they find a woman who refuses to stand. Nzinga Mbande is sent as an envoy, not yet queen, but already entrusted with the most dangerous task Ndongo can offer: negotiation under threat of annihilation. The Portuguese governor sits on a chair deliberately placed at the center of the meeting space. There is no seat for her. It is an insult disguised as protocol, a silent assertion that Ndongo now kneels. Nzinga pauses only briefly. Then she orders one of her attendants to kneel behind her and calmly sits upon his back, raising herself to eye level with the governor. The message is unmistakable. If Ndongo is to negotiate, it will do so as an equal. This moment survives in multiple Portuguese accounts, not because it shocked African observers, but because it unsettled Europeans. Diplomacy, as Nzinga understands it, is not courtesy. It is leverage. She speaks fluently, directly, and without apology. She demands the return of Ndongo lands, the withdrawal of Portuguese forts, and the recognition of her people's sovereignty. In return, she offers peace, not submission, not tribute, but coexistence. The governor listens because he must. Portuguese campaigns inland have stalled. Disease, resistance, and unreliable allies have turned easy conquest into costly stalemate. Nzinga exploits this weakness with precision. She understands Portuguese priorities: trade stability, missionary access, and above all, captives for the Atlantic trade. Her strategy is not to moralize the system, but to manipulate it. Christianity enters the room not as faith, but as instrument. Nzinga agrees to be baptized, taking the name Dona Ana de Sousa. Portuguese records frame this as conversion. In reality, it is calculated theater. Baptism opens diplomatic channels, temporarily halts hostilities, and buys Ndongo time. Nzinga does not abandon her cosmology. She expands her political vocabulary. The cross becomes another language of power. For a brief moment, the strategy works. Treaties are signed. Prisoners are released. Portuguese forces pull back from certain positions. But colonial promises are fragile things. Even as negotiations conclude, new forts are quietly reinforced. Allied Sobas are encouraged to defect. Raids continue under different pretexts. The Portuguese crown may authorize peace, but profit on the ground demands instability. When Nzinga's brother dies and she assumes the throne, diplomacy becomes survival itself. Her legitimacy is challenged internally, not because she is incapable, but because colonial pressure has warped succession politics. Rival claimants backed by Portuguese arms emerge, offering compliance in exchange for power. Ndongo fractures along lines engineered from the coast. Nzinga responds not with blind force, but with adaptability. When Ndongo becomes untenable, she retreats eastward and seizes Matamba, transforming it into a new center of resistance. This is not retreat as defeat. It is strategic relocation. Matamba offers defensible terrain, access to trade routes, and autonomy from Portuguese-controlled zones. Nzinga reconstitutes her state around mobility rather than fixed capitals. Her rule defies European categories. She leads councils, commands troops, and negotiates treaties. Portuguese observers struggle to describe her authority without distorting it, alternately portraying her as unnatural, dangerous, or exceptional. Labels that obscure the reality that her power is deeply African in structure and legitimacy. She rules through alliance building, ritual authority, and personal command, not novelty. Diplomacy under Nzinga is never static. She shifts between negotiation and warfare as conditions demand. When treaties collapse, she does not cling to them for appearance's sake. She adapts. Guerrilla tactics replace formal battles. Portuguese supply lines are harassed. Allied Sobas are turned back through negotiation or intimidation. Resistance becomes fluid, unpredictable, exhausting for an empire built on rigid hierarchies. Yet Nzinga never abandons the diplomatic arena. Even in war, envoys move. Messages are sent. Converts are counted. Appearances are maintained. She understands that survival depends not only on defeating Portuguese forces, but on denying them moral and political clarity. As long as legitimacy is contested, conquest remains incomplete. By the 1640s, her reputation stretches far beyond Central Africa. To the Portuguese, she is a persistent problem that refuses to die quietly. To African states navigating the same pressures, she is proof that resistance does not have to be suicidal to be effective. She has not stopped the tide of empire, but she has disrupted its rhythm, forcing it to negotiate with a woman it never intended to face as an equal. Diplomacy has not saved Ndongo from violence. Christianity has not shielded Matamba from attack. But Nzinga has achieved something rarer than victory. She has preserved agency. And in an age where colonial expansion feeds on inevitability, denying inevitability becomes its own form of power. War does not arrive with a declaration. It seeps into the countryside in fragments. Burned villages, empty fields, paths abandoned overnight. Under Nzinga's rule, conflict becomes constant, but never careless. This is not a kingdom charging toward annihilation. It is a state learning how to survive inside pressure. Portuguese commanders expect decisive battles. They prepare for formations, artillery exchanges, surrender ceremonies. Instead, they find absence. Nzinga refuses to give them the war they want. Her forces strike supply columns, vanish into forests, and reappear where forts were thought secure. Terrain replaces walls. Movement replaces permanence. The land itself becomes a collaborator. Matamba transforms into a militarized refuge. Displaced communities are absorbed, not as victims, but as participants. Nzinga reorganizes her society around endurance. Fields are planted away from main routes. Storage is decentralized. Intelligence flows through traders, captives, and defectors. Information becomes as valuable as weapons. Portuguese advances slow, not because they are defeated in spectacle, but because every step forward costs more than expected. European accounts struggle to explain this resistance without diminishing it. They describe Nzinga as deceptive, ruthless, ungovernable. What they are witnessing is strategic warfare adapted to asymmetry. Nzinga understands that her forces cannot win by matching Portuguese firepower, so she ensures they never have to. Conflict reshapes her authority. Nzinga leads from the center of decision-making, not from ritual distance. She addresses troops directly, rewarding loyalty, punishing betrayal decisively. Discipline is enforced because cohesion is survival. Unlike Portuguese commanders rotated in and out of Luanda, Nzinga's leadership is continuous. She remembers victories, failures, and faces. That continuity becomes a strategic advantage. The slave trade intensifies the violence. Portuguese campaigns increasingly blur warfare with raiding, targeting populations rather than armies. Captives are currency. Destabilization is profitable. Nzinga responds by disrupting those flows wherever possible, attacking slave routes, absorbing fugitives, and denying the Portuguese the human supply that sustains their economy. This does not end the trade, but it raises its cost. African allies of Portugal begin to reconsider their positions. Alignment with empire promises short-term gain, but invites long-term vulnerability. Nzinga exploits these doubts. She offers protection, marriage alliances, and autonomy within her expanding coalition. Resistance becomes not a single army, but a network. Flexible, political, resilient. Portuguese forts remain, but they feel increasingly isolated. Garrisons depend on constant reinforcement. Disease spreads faster than authority. Governors complain to Lisbon about expenses, manpower shortages, and an enemy who refuses to collapse. Nzinga becomes a fixed problem in imperial correspondence, a reminder that conquest is not progressing as planned. This prolonged resistance changes the region. Power no longer flows from fixed capitals alone. It moves with people, information, and allegiance. Nzinga's state is less visible on European maps, but more durable on the ground. She has not created peace. She has created time. Time for her people to exist outside total domination. By mid-century, the war has become generational. Children grow into fighters. Fighters become elders. Nzinga herself ages, but her command does not weaken. She adapts again, consolidating authority, formalizing succession, and stabilizing Matamba as a recognized power rather than a temporary refuge. Portuguese officials now negotiate not to end resistance, but to manage it. The irony is unavoidable. The longer the empire fights to erase her, the more permanent her presence becomes. Nzinga is no longer just resisting colonial expansion. She is reshaping how it unfolds, forcing delay, negotiation, compromise. She cannot stop the Atlantic system alone, but she can refuse to be consumed by it. In a world that rewards speed and submission, Nzinga's greatest weapon is endurance. The war does not end with victory. It continues with survival. And in that survival, the meaning of power begins to shift. The war widens the moment new sails appear on the horizon. In the 1640s, the Atlantic world fractures as European empires turn on one another, and Central Africa becomes a contested prize in a conflict far larger than Ndongo or Matamba. For Nzinga, this is not a distant struggle. It is an opening. The Dutch seize Luanda from the Portuguese in 1641, disrupting decades of colonial control. Forts change hands. Supply chains collapse. For the first time in years, Portuguese authority on the coast weakens visibly. Nzinga recognizes the shift immediately. She does not mistake the Dutch for liberators. She understands them as rivals to her enemy, and rivals can be useful. Alliance replaces isolation. Nzinga sends envoys to the Dutch West India Company, offering cooperation against a shared adversary. The partnership is pragmatic, not ideological. The Dutch provide firearms, training, and access to trade. Nzinga provides local knowledge, manpower, and pressure from the interior. Together, they force Portuguese forces into retreat, reclaiming territories long contested. This alignment places Nzinga squarely within global geopolitics. Her resistance is no longer framed solely as a regional rebellion. It becomes a variable in imperial calculations, stretching from Amsterdam to Lisbon. Decisions made in European boardrooms now account for an African ruler who refuses to disappear. Yet the alliance carries contradictions. The Dutch are deeply embedded in the Atlantic slave trade themselves. Their interests are commercial, not humanitarian. Nzinga navigates this tension with the same realism that has defined her rule. She seeks leverage, not purity. The goal remains autonomy, not moral absolution in an immoral system. As battles unfold, Matamba's forces coordinate movements with Dutch troops, pressing Portuguese strongholds from multiple directions. Victories follow. Portuguese correspondence grows urgent, describing losses not only of territory, but of credibility. Empire, once projected as unstoppable, now appears negotiable. But global politics are unstable. European wars end. Alliances shift. By 1648, the Portuguese retake Luanda, aided by reinforcements from Brazil. The Dutch withdraw, their calculations changing with the balance of profit and risk. Once again, Nzinga finds herself confronting empire alone. This moment could have shattered her state. Instead, it forces another transformation. Nzinga pivots back to diplomacy, reopening negotiations with Portugal from a position strengthened by years of resistance. The Portuguese, chastened by loss and expense, now approach talks differently. They no longer speak as if conquest is inevitable. They bargain. Treaties are signed recognizing Nzinga as Queen of Matamba and Ndongo, affirming territorial boundaries and reducing direct military confrontation. Christianity re-enters the political stage, this time less as theater and more as framework for coexistence. Missionaries are permitted. Trade resumes under negotiated terms. Peace, fragile but real, takes hold. This peace is not surrender. Portuguese forts remain. The slave trade continues. But Nzinga has achieved something rare in the colonial era: formal recognition without total subjugation. Her state exists not as a tolerated anomaly, but as a negotiated reality. The Atlantic world continues to churn around her. Ships carry people across oceans. Empires rise and fall in distant capitals. But in Central Africa, Nzinga's longevity alters the tempo of history. Portuguese expansion resumes, but cautiously, shaped by the memory of decades lost to resistance. By the time Nzinga reaches old age, she has outlasted governors, generals, and alliances. Her survival becomes her argument. She has proven that African political agency does not vanish at the sight of European sails. It adapts, negotiates, and endures. The irony deepens. The systems that sought to erase her sovereignty end up legitimizing it, if only partially. Nzinga's story is no longer confined to battlefields. It is written into treaties, correspondence, and the global record of an empire forced to compromise. She dies in 1663, in her 80s, having ruled longer than most of the men sent to defeat her. Portuguese officials record her passing with restraint, aware that an era has closed. What they do not record is the full weight of what failed. Ndongo and Matamba were not conquered quickly. Expansion stalled, adapted, and compromised because one African ruler refused to disappear on schedule. Portuguese control over Central Africa continues after Nzinga, and the Atlantic slave trade deepens its scars. Empires eventually impose their systems with greater force and coordination. Nzinga does not stop this future, but she bends its path. Decades of delay mean generations spared immediate displacement, alliances preserved, cultures sustained longer than imperial planners intended. Her legacy resists simplification. She is neither a flawless hero nor a tragic symbol. She operates within violent systems because survival demands it. She negotiates with slavers while sheltering the displaced. She converts without surrendering identity. These contradictions are not moral failures. They are the reality of power exercised under constraint. Later centuries struggle to categorize her. Colonial narratives diminish her as anomaly. Modern retellings risk mythologizing her into legend. Both approaches miss the truth. Nzinga is most remarkable not because she is singular, but because she reveals what African states were capable of when forced to adapt to global intrusion. In her time, European expansion is often described as inevitable. Nzinga proves it was not simple. Empire advances, but not uncontested, not unchallenged, not without negotiation, loss, and compromise. She exposes the cost hidden beneath narratives of progress. Today, her image appears on monuments, currency, and in scholarship reclaiming African political history from caricature. Yet her most important legacy is quieter. It lives in the evidence that resistance can be strategic rather than suicidal. That power can be exercised without total victory. That survival can alter history's pace. Nzinga did not paint an army into existence or vanish an empire with illusion. She did something harder. She forced a global system built on speed and extraction to slow down and reckon with a woman it could not remove. And in that delay, in that stubborn refusal to yield, she left a mark large enough to be remembered not as legend, but as history.